One autumn evening in Dublin, the wind drifted softly through the window of a quiet apartment where an exhausted woman sat in silence, staring at the steamless rim of a forgotten cup of tea, her eyes ringed with shadows of sleepless nights and her voice carrying the tremor of someone who had spent too long fighting the same unending battle. That woman was Caitriona Balfe, the actress who had carved her name into the hearts of audiences across the world through her iconic role in Outlander. Yet, who now found herself no longer celebrated but crushed beneath the weight of her own memories, speaking to a journalist who dared not interrupt the pauses that lingered heavily between her words, for what she was sharing was not a story of fame nor success, but of sacrifice, devotion, and betrayal. She confessed, almost in a whisper, that she never imagined she would one day sit down and admit that the last 10 years of work, passion, love, and loyalty had in the end rewarded her only with pain, disillusionment, and the bitter knowledge that the man she had once thought her greatest blessing was in truth her deepest wound. And as she bowed her head, gripping a tissue that shook between her fingers, her tears fell onto the table as though dissolving the fragile remains of a once precious life. For she believed she had lost everything: her family, her friends, her peace of mind. And all because she had trusted in the love of Sam Heughan, the strong Scottish actor with whom she had shared more than just screen chemistry. Behind the glamour, their story began innocently, when both were cast in Outlander, he embodying the ruggedness of a Highland warrior, she carrying the poise and maturity of a woman who had weathered many storms in life. And in those long hours rehearsing lines together, speaking of hopes and fears, and sharing laughter between takes, a bond had formed that at first appeared to be friendship, but which quickly deepened into something more, something neither dared declare openly, for the demands of fame required discretion, yet in private their stolen glances, their touches, their moments by the fire in Scotland told a truth the cameras could not capture. She remembered vividly the evenings when the chill of the Highlands pressed against her skin, and Sam would drape his coat across her shoulders, whispering promises that one day they would no longer need to hide. Words that seemed to breathe security into her soul, words that made her believe he was her future, her anchor, her forever. And because of that belief, she chose him in ways that would prove irreversible. She refused projects that could have advanced her career simply to remain near him. She endured the sting of gossip and the judgment of strangers in silence. She sacrificed the fragile threads of her marriage to Tony McGill, letting go of a man who had once been her partner because she believed Sam was the one true love she could not abandon. And though she felt her family's disappointment and sensed her friends' doubts, she told herself it was all worth it, because in her eyes what they had was real and rare, a love worth every loss. Yet as time passed, cracks began to appear in that dream, for Sam, who had once poured his attention into her, gradually grew distant, consumed by new projects, enticed by long journeys and extravagant parties, his world expanding while hers seemed to shrink into the quiet spaces he left behind. And when whispers of his closeness with other women began to reach her ears, she confronted him, her heart heavy with suspicion. But each time he would smile faintly, dismiss her worries, assure her she was the only one he loved, and no doubt nod at her. She forced herself to believe, because believing was easier than facing the abyss of betrayal. Yet the abyss arrived, sudden and merciless. The night photographs surfaced of him holding hands with Dakota Johnson at a party in Los Angeles, and the world erupted. Fans debated, the media swarmed, images of their intimacy circulated endlessly online, and in the midst of that storm, Caitriona phoned Sam in desperation, her tears wetting the receiver as she demanded the truth, only to be met not with comfort but with the sharp, cold indifference of words that would haunt her forever. "We were never officially a couple, Kat," he said, slicing through the decade of sacrifices, the promises by the fire, the nights of hidden tenderness, reducing them all to a shadow she had apparently imagined. And in that moment her entire world collapsed. The betrayal was not only in the act itself, but in the erasure of what she had given, for Sam did not simply leave. He denied the very love she had built her life upon, and as the days turned into weeks, the headlines continued to scream of his romance with Dakota. each photograph of their affection reopening the wound that had not even begun to close, while Caitriona remained silent to the public, her dignity intact but her heart shattered, replaying in her mind the choices she had made, the family ties she had let wither, the friends she had alienated, the marriage she had forsaken, the roles she had declined, all for a man who, in the end, claimed she had never been his at all, and in her solitude, she wrestled with the cruel paradox of love, that it can lift us higher than the stars and yet leave us more broken than we ever thought possible. And as she sat before the journalist on that autumn night, confessing her truth, her voice trembled not only with grief, but with the realization that what she had lost was not just him, but herself, the woman she once was before she gave everything to a promise that dissolved into betrayal. And while the world outside continued to turn, filled with laughter, stories, and other people's beginnings, for Caitriona Balfe time seemed to have paused in that moment of collapse. Her soul caught between the past she could not undo and the uncertain silence of a future she no longer knew how to believe in. For though she was an actress admired for her strength and grace, behind the curtain she was only a woman who had loved, and in loving too completely, had been left with nothing but the fragments of what once seemed eternal. On a gray evening when Dublin's skies threatened rain, Caitriona Balfe sat quietly in her apartment with a journalist who had come not for gossip, but for the truth that had weighed heavily upon her shoulders, and though she tried to sit with composure, the tremor in her voice betrayed the depth of her wounds, for she remembered the moment that had undone her entire world, the instant Sam Heughan, once her confidant, her promised companion, the man for whom she had sacrificed her marriage, distanced herself from her family, and surrendered countless career opportunities, looked into her eyes and uttered the words that would echo through her every waking hour. "We never existed," words so cruelly dismissive that they seemed to erase in a breath the hundreds of messages he had once written in which he declared his devotion, the whispered dreams of a wedding beneath the Scottish skies, the long nights of filming when, in the stillness behind the cameras, he would wrap her in his arms and murmur of the future they would one day share. Yet now, those tender vows had disintegrated into a cold denial, and the dissonance between the man who had held her in the dark and the man who later stood before cameras declaring with a faint smile, "We are good friends, that's all," became for her a wound sharper than betrayal itself, for it was not simply rejection but erasure, a refusal to acknowledge what had once been the axis of her life, and every denial he gave in interviews was, too, her heart, like salt rubbed mercilessly into a wound that could not scab, leaving her questioning not only his sincerity but also her own judgment, asking herself whether the years she believed were rooted in love had in fact been nothing more than a cruel illusion. This despair consumed her in the months that followed, for Caitriona, once radiant on red carpets and commanding on screen, found herself unable to face the world, declining press conferences, hiding away from premieres, considering abandoning acting altogether. For she confessed she felt like a fool, like a woman who had given everything she had, her marriage to Tony McGill, the trust of her family, the loyalty of old friends, her very sense of peace, in exchange for a mirage. And when her parents urged her to return to Ireland, to retreat into the quiet safety of rural life, she almost yielded. But each time she tried to imagine a life without him, the memories intruded, the laughter, the promises, the way his hand had fitted so perfectly into hers, and tears would spill down her cheeks, betraying her longing. Yet though fans across the world, who still admired her for her strength as Claire Fraser, sent letters by the thousands, filled with encouragement, prayers, and affirmations that she was their goddess, their role model, their warrior, she admitted in secret that never had she felt so weak, so stripped of identity. For fame cannot shield one from heartbreak, nor can adoration erase the emptiness of a love denied, and her loneliness deepened until, at last, she decided upon confrontation, determined to hear the truth directly, to meet the man who had once promised forever and ask him why. The opportunity came at an Outlander reunion, when the laughter of colleagues had faded and the room grew silent. She walked towards him, her eyes swollen with unshed tears, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Sam, Do you know what I lost because of you?" And for a moment he said nothing, the silence pressing down like stone, until at last he sighed and answered, "Kat, I'm sorry, but I never wanted this to be so serious." Words that cut her more deeply than any tabloid headline, for they reduced a decade of devotion, the sacrifices of career and marriage, the promises by the fire, to nothing more than a game he had grown tired of playing, and she stood paralyzed, the weight of disillusionment pressing until, with tears spilling silently, she turned from him without another word, walking away not in anger but in the resignation of someone who at last understood that to cling any longer was to continue bleeding. In the days and weeks that followed, she allowed herself to break, but through that breaking, something else emerged. For time, though slow, is merciful in its own way, and gradually the wound that once consumed her began. Though the scar would always remain, and in that healing Caitriona returned to work, not with the glittering projects that once sought her, but with smaller independent films that allowed her to rediscover her craft, to act not for fame but for truth, and she began engaging with social causes, speaking at events, lending her voice to women's issues, building a new identity not as half of a secret couple, but as a woman whole in herself. In an online chat with fans, tears returned as she confessed, "I lost everything because of an unworthy love, but I learned that no one can save me but myself. I will stand up no matter how many times I fall," and millions of responses flooded in, messages calling her a warrior, affirming her courage, reminding her that even in her vulnerability, she was inspiring others to survive their own betrayals. And so when she sat once more in her Dublin apartment, telling her story to the journalist, her eyes still shimmered with sorrow, but her gaze carried new resilience. And she made it clear she did not share her tale to assign blame, but to illuminate a truth that too many ignore, that sometimes we give ourselves entirely to a love unworthy of us, and in losing everything we find not just despair but also a chance to be reborn, to learn to love ourselves, to step through the storm and find, even with scars, a brighter horizon waiting. And as she looked out through the window at the rain beginning to fall, she smiled faintly through her tears, aware that though Sam Heughan had left her scarred, though his denials had nearly undone her, life itself was not finished with her, and beyond the betrayal lay the possibility of renewal, for darkness may linger but never reign forever. And she, having endured it, had found in herself not just the actress adored by millions but the woman who, after walking through the fire, could stand alone, resilient, and unafraid of the future that awaited. Caitriona Balfe once admitted the most painful truth of her life. "I lost everything, my peace, my family, my friends. And in the end, all I was left with was betrayal." These words were not simply a confession, they were the cry of a broken heart. For years she had believed that Sam Heughan was not only her co-star in Outlander, but the love of her life, the man she had sacrificed everything for. She walked away from her marriage, turned down major projects, and even accepted the loss of close friendships, because she trusted the promises he whispered. "One day we won't need to hide. I promise you." But time changed everything. As Sam's career flourished, as new projects, glamorous events, and new faces filled his life, Caitriona began to sense a distance growing between them. She would ask him about the rumors, about the photographs of him with other women, but he would only smile faintly and say, "You worry too much. You're the only one I love." And she wanted so desperately to believe him. Until the day the tabloids captured him hand in hand with Dakota Johnson at a party in Los Angeles. The photographs were everywhere. The world demanded answers. And when Caitriona called him, her voice shaking with tears, and asked, "Are you betraying me?" the answer that came was like a knife through her chest. "We were never truly a couple, Kat." In that moment, her entire world collapsed. All the years of whispered promises, late-night conversations, and secret hopes for a wedding one day, all of it felt like a cruel illusion. And the deepest wound of all was that when journalists asked him about her, Sam only smiled and said, "We're good friends, that's all." Those cold denials felt like salt ground into an open wound. For months, she disappeared into silence. She avoided the press, declined appearances, and even considered leaving acting altogether. The woman the public admired as a goddess, as a warrior, felt weaker than she had ever felt in her life. Yet the very pain that nearly destroyed her slowly began to give her strength. She realized no one was coming to save her. She would have to rescue herself. She began to accept independent film projects, she engaged in social causes, and she reconnected with her craft. In an online chat with fans, tears streamed down her face as she spoke, but her voice carried a new conviction. I lost everything because of an unworthy love. But I have learned that the only person who can truly save me is myself. I will rise again, no matter how many times I fall. Fans from across the world responded with overwhelming support, calling her a warrior, sending millions of words of encouragement, reminding her that her story was not over. And still, the memories lingered. There was one final meeting with Sam during an Outlander crew gathering. When the others had left, she approached him, eyes red, voice trembling, and asked, "Sam, do you know what I gave up because of you?" He sighed, lowered his gaze, and said softly, "Kat, I'm sorry, but I never meant for it to be this serious." In that moment, she realized everything. The years, the sacrifices, the promises had meant far more to her than to him. She turned away, tears falling, but this time she knew it was the last. Time moved on, and so did she. The scar would always remain, but the wound began to heal. She chose to rise, to reclaim her art, to rebuild her life on her own terms. And when she sat down in Dublin years later, telling her story with quiet strength, she no longer spoke from bitterness, but from resilience. I don't tell this to blame anyone. I tell it because sometimes we lose everything for the wrong love. But we must never let betrayal define us. We must stand, and we must learn to love ourselves again. Outside her window, the rain began to fall, tapping softly against the glass. And as she looked out, a faint smile crossed her tear-stained face. For Caitriona Balfe had walked through the darkest storm, and though Sam Heughan had left her scarred, she had discovered something greater than love lost. She had found her own strength and a brighter future waiting.